Support for this episode of Trifles is brought to you by the Baker Street Journal, the leading publication of Sherlockian scholarship since 1946. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. And also by the generous support of listeners like you who choose to support us at Patreon for as little as $1 a month. Patreon.com/trifles.
Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, there were 3 gables, 5 orange pips, and a sign of 4, but there are hundreds of other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever stopped to wonder about how much money Holmes actually collected from the Duke of Holderness? Or why Watson constantly had to read the telegrams to him?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 326, Dueling Topics, Watson's Gender. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we get into the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, are you ready to duel?
I'm ready to single. I'm ready to duel. I'm ready to multiple. I'm ready to do anything that involves, moving digits around and putting out arguments. I think that's what we're really talking about today.
Oh, well, the internet will love us then, because not only is the internet about moving around digits, it is about getting into heated arguments. And this is a topic, a very interesting topic, that was suggested to us by listener Erik Deckers. Erik said, hey, why don't you take a single topic and find where 2 Sherlockian scholars have argued about it in some form or fashion over the years and kind of take both of their sides and see how it goes. So we delved into the long past to come up with this particular subject. It's an interesting one. I think folks are going to be pretty intrigued about it. So just before we begin, I wanted to remind you that you can find the show notes for this episode at ihose.co/trifles326. That's all lowercase, ihose.co/trifles326. That'll take you to the not the I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere. That's the other podcast. The Trifles website, SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. You can sign up for email updates from us. Of course, you can follow us on the podcast player of your choice, wherever you happen to be listening to us right now. Just hit the subscribe or follow button and make sure you're getting our updates. And if you do happen to make it to the website, you can become a patron for as little as $1 a month. We do have some thank you gifts for our patrons, and every Patreon supporter has the opportunity to listen to the show ad-free. Isn't that wonderful?
Oh, it's magnificent. Talk about generosity. Very impressive.
Indeed, indeed. Well, let's get on with the generosity of our words, and stay tuned because at the end of the show we do have a drawing for which all of our Patreon supporters are eligible, so you want to stay tuned for that. All right. Now, Burt, it's only appropriate that we begin this special feature. I think there will be future episodes in this series of dueling topics. We begin with probably one of the most famous Sherlockian duels of all time. This goes all the way back to the 1940s, back when Sherlockian societies were just a figment of everyone's imagination. The Baker Street Irregulars started meeting in 1934 and met for a couple of years and then reconstituted in 1940. And you began to see a lot of Sherlockian groups around the country spring forth from that. But it was at these annual dinners of the Baker Street Irregulars that as I say, a legendary debate began to sprout. And it all began with a paper presented by a very famous person. Who was that person, and what was the paper?
Well, the paper was 8.5 by 11, I think, and it was typed, I think, on a Royal typewriter, if I remember, with an elite font and a black ribbon. Normally, you would have ribbons, that were half red and half black, but I think it was just typed on an all-black ribbon, because I think the idea was that if you got to the end of the ribbon, then you could just rotate it and use the bottom half, or the top half, conversely, that had not been used, to get more longevity out of your typewriter. Have I answered all of your questions?
Well, maybe I can rotate you to actually answering with a Sherlockian paper.
Well, we're talking, but you see, this is part of what's going on here, because this was preposterous fun, and you are appropriately locating this in the 1940s. And as we get into it, we'll see a lot of attitudes and imaginings about the role of men and women that are really anchored in the 1940s. But it's a paper by Rex Todhunter Stout, an American writer noted for his characters Nero Wolff and his assistant Archie Goodwin. And he was a great Sherlockian, a great fan of Sherlock Holmes. And of course, he based some characteristics of his detective Nero Wolff on Holmes's brother Mycroft. And indeed, among other things, he opined over the years about the successful structure of the name of a detective. And in doing that, he looked back to Sherlock Holmes and pointed out that the first word Sherlock has an E and an O, and the last word Holmes has an O, and that parallel between Sherlock Holmes, the consonants, the vowels, and Nero Wolff was something he did very intentionally. So he was an iconoclast, a great writer, a great character. And that's what led him in the 1940s to propose to the Baker Street Irregulars that he had a very unusual but astonishing set of conclusions to share with them about exactly who Dr. Watson was.
Yeah, and he began his paper by saying, "You will forgive me for refusing to join your commemorative toast, the second Mrs. Watson, when you learn it was a matter of conscience. I couldn't bring myself to connive at the perpetration of a hoax. Not only was there never a second Mrs. Watson, there was not even a first Mrs. Watson. Furthermore, there was no Dr. Watson. Please, keep your chairs."
Keep your chairs. You're going to need them later.
Yeah. So a shocking opening to this paper, and that I don't think anyone expected. It was certainly not given as a titled presentation.
No, so, but this is the days too. And you referred to this earlier, when Sherlockian Sherlockian societies were all men at the time, but also in their early childhood sort of days. And so this is not an academic paper. This is an after-dinner conversation, meant to stimulate the blood pressure and meant to get a reaction. And that's what a lot of Rex Stout's work was all about. And
when you imagine everybody was soporific by that point in the dinner, you needed a little jolt to come alive.
That's right. You want to wake people up. And of course, the nice thing about one of the many nice things about this paper is that when he starts, Rex Stout does it by locating a point, an apparently inarguable point about something he's observed in the Sherlockian canon. And he says, the writer of these tales, the Watson person, describes over and over in detail the minutiae of this famous household, the suppers and the breakfasts and the arrangement of furniture and rainy evenings at home. But we never are shown Holmes or Watson going to bed.
How do you like that? And, this is the perfect topic for us here on Trifles because we specialize in the minutia around the Sherlock Holmes story. So Rex Stout seems to be ripped from the trifling audience.
Well, it's a great, because he just, having leapt off the diving board at this point, he just keeps diving through the air. He says, I wondered why that is. I got suspicious. Now he says, ugly possibilities occurred to me that Holmes had false teeth or that Watson wore a toupee, but that would be preposterous.
But as he goes through the canon and finds snippets of text here, he realizes that there's another perspective, and he says, I was indescribably shocked. How had so patent a clue escaped so many millions of readers through the years? That could only be a woman speaking of a man. Read it over. The true, authentic speech of a wife telling of her husband. But wait, I was not indulging in an idle speculation, but in seeking evidence to establish a fact. It was unquestionably a woman speaking of a man. And he said, I admit I blushed. I blushed for Sherlock Holmes. I closed the book. But the fire of curiosity was raging in me, and soon I opened again to the same page, and there was the next paragraph I saw. The reader may set me down as a hopeless busybody, Watson writes, when I confess how much this man stimulated my curiosity, and how often I endeavored to break through the reticence which he showed on that all concerned himself. You bet she did. She would.
Yeah, there's two things to point out here. One is this first thing that occurred to him before that previous quote about Watson is in Study in Scarlet, when Watson writes, it was rare for him to be up after 10 at night, and he had invariably breakfasted and gone out before I rose in the morning. And that's what he's referring to when he says how could so patent a clue have escaped so many millions of readers, because it's a woman speaking of a man. And the other thing is, this is, just to remind our listeners, this is a 1940s view of man-wife relations. So this is, a time when the woman would be in the kitchen, and we're trying to imagine Sherlock Holmes at home, and what he might be doing in this more relaxed domestic atmosphere. So that's what's behind a lot of this.
Yeah. And, as he continues to pick out snippets of text from the canon, they continue to prove that point. From The Creeping Man, he pulls this little gem. The relations between us in those latter days were peculiar. He was a man of habits, narrow and concentrated habits, and I had become one of them. As an institution, I was like the violin, shag tobacco, the old black pipe, the index books, and others perhaps less excusable. So again, Watson returning after being out for a while, Holmes smoking the pipe and not having opened the window. Holmes says, I suppose it's pretty thick now that you mention it. He says, thick, it's intolerable. Intolerable! Watson, an inveterate pipe smoker himself, says it's intolerable. And Rex Stout writes, I say husband and wife. Could anyone alive doubt it after reading that painful, banal scene? Is there any need to pile on the evidence?
Well, and then he goes into more things that he decides to present as evidence. The efforts to break Holmes of his cocaine habit that are mentioned in various places. Displays, says Stout, a typical reformist wife in action, especially the final gloating over her success. Now, this tells you maybe more about Rex Stout and his home life than it does about Watson. But, and he tells us a little bit about Reichenbach, and he points out, Watson fainted. My goodness, a man, wouldn't faint at a time like that. all of this explanation about what happened at Reichenbach and where he was, it is simply gibberish below the level even of a village half-wit. It's impossible to suppose that Holmes ever dreamed of imposing on any sane person with an explanation like that. And so he didn't.
Exactly. And where Stout winds up is really interesting because in the classic Sherlockian puzzle-solving manner, he manages to turn his clues into an acrostic. And he goes through 11 tales. He says there are 60 tales all told, but the first step is to set them down in chronological order and number them from 1 to 60. And then he begins to go through. He says, let's see, evidently the reason why Watson was at such pains to conceal her name in this clutter of title was to mystify us. So the number to start with should be the most mystical number, namely 7, the number 7. And to make it doubly sure, we shall make it 7 times 7, which is 49. All very well. The 49th tale is The Adventure of the Illustrious Client. So he puts down illustrious client, and we get the I from illustrious client as the first letter in the acrostic. And he continues to do this, to make this case through the next 10 tales. The Red-Headed League, the Engineer's Thumb, the Norwood Builder, the Empty House. If you're keeping track, that's illustrious client was I, R for Red-Headed League, E for Engineer's Thumb, N for Norwood Builder, E for Empty House. What does that spell out?
Mother, I think. No,
it's for the
out,
many. No.
It spells out Irene, illustrious Red-Headed League, engineers, Norwood, Empty House, Irene.
Yes.
And then he goes on.
Yes, go.
No, well, you go. You take us through the rest of the acrostic.
Oh, well, to cut to the chase, the next 6 cases that he lays out are W, Wisteria Lodge, A, Abbey Grange, T, Twisted Lip, S, Study in Scarlet, O, Orange Pips, N, Noble Bachelor. Put it all together, and what have you got? Irene Watson.
Yeah. Very, very, very cute. Very cute. And all that misdirection there about the cases, the number 7, the number 11, disregard this, the 4th integer, blah, blah, blah. That's sort of like the misdirection that a great magician uses in a card trick when he or she already knows that you're looking at the 4 of clubs and that's going to be your card. That sort of charming nonsense. But
yeah.
that's Rex Stout's Watson was a woman, and how on earth could anyone respond to that?
Well, we will tell you right after this quick word from our sponsor. When you're looking for reference material regarding the Sherlock Holmes stories, the Baker Street Journal has been providing thoughtful articles since 1946. The topics range from the trifling to deep conundrums, but they all center around Sherlockian scholarship. And maybe you've been subscribing for years, or maybe you have yet to subscribe. But there's one resource that can make your research easier to do: the EBSJ. The EBSJ is an electronic copy of all the back issues of the Baker Street Journal from its inception in 1946 through 2011 in PDF format. That's 276 issues with more than 18,000 pages, spanning the old series to the new series, the Christmas annuals, all the way through 2011. It's entirely searchable, so you can find what you need in just seconds. Check out the EBSJ on BakerStreetIrregulars.com today. Okay, we're back, and here to defend the honor of Watson is none other than, well, the second editor of the Baker Street Journal, the second leader of the Baker Street Irregulars. Actually, is that third? Does Morley count as one? I would imagine he does. Morley
Oh,
Smith.
yeah, I would
And
think
then
so. Sure.
Julian Wolff. Julian Wolff steps forth with a paper that was titled "That Was No Lady." It came to Watson's defense in an essay that I think was published in.
I think it was the Baker Street Journal, wasn't it?
Well, I think that may have been too early for the Baker Street Journal. Now that I think about it,
Oh, that's right. 44.
it may have been in Edgar Smith's 1944.
Well, it's in Profiles by Gaslight. certainly.
Profiles by Gaslight, 1944.
Yeah, both of these papers, we should tell our listeners, are in Profiles by Gaslight, which is, generally pretty available in various editions.
Yeah, and we do have a link to a PDF of the Saturday Review of Literature, where Rex Stout's paper originally appeared, March of 1941.
Oh, right.
So, but do you have the copy of That Was No Lady handy?
Yeah, right in front of me.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Start us out.
Well, here now, we should remind our listeners that Julian Wolff was a doctor, Julian Wolff, M.D., and there's a point which you'll hear in a minute, why I underscore that. But Edgar, in his introduction to this, introduces Julian's paper. He says, not satisfied with the demolishment of the theory that had only mysticism and rhetoric to support it, Dr. Wolff proceeds by argument and persuasion to redeem the good doctor from a state of femininity to a state of epicenity. Well, anyway, we're into the paper, and the first part of this, Julian Wolff, now who is a physician and not a writer of fiction, begins by saying, look, I'm entering into a literary controversy with Mr. Stout. And I am immediately conscious of being at a great disadvantage because, I don't necessarily have the skill to respond to this preposterous assertion. But all true irregulars have been amazed by this theory that Dr. Watson, John H. Watson, M.D., was a nom de plume for Mrs. Irene Holmes. And it has one inherent fault. It is intrinsically possible. But Rex Stout has supported it by quotations from the sacred writings, and therefore it can't be lightly dismissed. But he proceeds to do that. He says, the first of Rex's quotations is taken from A Study in Scarlet. But we're told in that case that Watson took his degree of Doctor of Medicine in 1878 at the University of London and then proceeded to Netley to go through the course prescribed for surgeons in the army, and then was attached to the 5th Northumberland Fusiliers and was wounded at the Battle of Maiwand. It's not necessary to point out that no woman did all this, and also frequented the Criterion Bar and smoked ship's tobacco.
She could have been a hard-charging lady. I don't know. Yeah, and then we have the fainting spell that Stout quoted from The Empty House.
Right.
And Watson, or Stout, Julian Wolff writes, conveniently omits the words, for the first and last time in my life, regarding the fainting spell. And by this omission, the sense of the text has been altered. No, a man has to explain a fainting spell. No woman would find an explanation necessary. On the contrary, occasionally the weaker sex frequently seems proud of this weakness and is known to simulate it on occasion. So, Wolff says, the samples already analyzed will convince the most irregular mind that it is not necessary to discuss each quotation in detail. However, a brief glance through the writings will reveal numerous significant incidents. And he begins to enumerate them.
Yes, and they're compelling. Holmes would hardly have sent his wife away overnight to an obscure corner of Essex in the company of Josiah Amberley, and the events of Hound of Baskervilles and Watson's actions don't really resonate to that of a woman. and so on and so forth. But he says, look, as a final clincher, we have only to quote the description of Watson obtained by Lestrade from the members of Milverton's household. He was a middle-sized, strongly built man, square jaw, thick neck, mustache. Well, obviously, Mr. Stout will have to chercher elsewhere for la femme. But now Julian, of course, coming back here, decides to do one along the lines of Stout's conclusion. He says, it is to be read in the titles of certain of the tales themselves that by taking the first letter in the first line and the second letter in the second line and so on, after arranging the titles in the following mystic order. So again, here he's taking the titles of certain tales by taking the first letter in the first line, the second letter in the second line. And he has Naval Treaty, Musgrave Ritual, Retired Colorman, Missing Three-Quarters, Solitary Cyclist, Shoscombe Old Place, Blue Carbuncle, Copper Beeches, Sussex Vampire, Gloria Scott, Case of Identity, Noble Bachelor, Illustrious Client, Resident Patient. Well, by doing that, first letter in the first line, second letter in the second line, what do you have? It spells out nuts to Rex
Stout. That was very, very cleverly done. You have to hand it to Dr. Wolff. Even in his scientific approach, he managed to bring some humor to it and to make that a kind of a diagonal acrostic. I've never seen that done before.
Well, and the nice conclusion here, which is just worth a sentence or two, is after having done all that, Julian follows with some observations upon the nature of Watson's wound. And, one of the cute things about this, since we're just summarizing this, Julian says, look, it's obvious, because he reviews the confusion, occasionally in the leg, occasionally in the shoulder. And Julian says, well, since it's obvious that one wound could not involve both his leg and his shoulder, it's reasonable to assume that the wound was located halfway between the parts mentioned. In other words, it was a wound in the groin.
Yeah.
And there he leaves it.
Well, and here we shall leave it too. A fascinating duel between two monumental Sherlockians. Where do you fall on this spectrum? I think the beautiful thing about this is we can read anything we want to into the canon, and so we shall continue doing so. Okay, well, we promised you our drawing for all of our Patreon supporters, and this is the end of the quarter, so we actually do two drawings in this episode. The first will be for a back issue of the Baker Street Journal, and the second will be for an annual subscription to the Baker Street Journal. Just a reminder, if you are not yet a patron, then you are not eligible to take part in these fabulous prizes. So just head to patreon.com/trifles or hit the link in our show notes to become a patron. For as little as $1 a month, you can be eligible to be part of this drawing. Let's go. All right, the first number is number 6. And that looks like that is Stephen White. Stephen, congratulations. You are the lucky recipient of a back issue of the Baker Street Journal. Let's give it another spin for our big winner for the annual subscription. Here we go. All right, the suspense is killing me. And this is Ron Greenwood. Ron, congratulations. You will be getting these prizes to you. We'll be touching base with you to make sure we have your address and information, but otherwise expect to hear from us and to get your prize at some point in the near future. Well, thank you once again for joining us here on Trifles, and if anything, It's just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
From what I have seen of the lady, yes, indeed, she is on a very different level to your Majesty.